Interview with Hillary Clinton in the family quarters at the White House, February, what's the date? 20th, 1993.
After another. I mean, just terrible strep throats. And I'd get over it, and 2 weeks later, I'd have another sore throat. And I was going to every doctor, and, I was taking penicillin and all that stuff. And I was just sick all the time. And people wanted to take my tonsils out, which I didn't want them to do. And finally, I was up visiting. My parents have this cottage up in this little tiny lake in northeastern Pennsylvania. Once again, terrible, terrible strep throat. And went to a little country doctor who had his office in his house. He pulled up, and it was like in his garage. And I went to see him. I never had seen him before. I'd heard about him for years. And he gave me a shot of penicillin, and he said, and I said, I'm so discouraged. I get these terrible sore throats all the time. What can I do? He said, cover your neck. Because I was like most kids who I look at my daughter. You go running around in the cold weather, and you don't have anything on your neck, and you read these articles which say, well, there's really no relationship between whether you're warm or cold because it's all viruses and bacteria and all this stuff. But this old guy said to me, cover your neck. Well, I have worn turtlenecks from about November until May for the last 20 years, and I don't have them anymore. So that's my...
So that's where scarves work, though. Because they're very pretty accents, too. You've popularized scarves again.
Oh, good. I love scarves. Well, were Norman and Barbara there?
Yes, Norris said, would you please ask her when she's going to invite us to the White House? End of quote.
Soon.
And I heard yesterday, because I've been traveling, I haven't talked to him since the other night. And I was told, one of the people at the studio told me he's going back to Russia. So I don't know.
What is he doing there?
He's gotten contacts. He's in Minsk, which is where Oswald lived before the assassination. And he's gotten I don't know how he's done it, he's gotten some deal with the KGB where they're opening files to him on Oswald's stay in Minsk.
Does he have someone he can trust who can read Russian?
There's a lot of friends over there. But he's interviewing people that knew him, because he thinks there's he very much believes in the whole conspiracy thing. So that's the second volume of Harlot's Ghost, I guess, is going to focus on the Kennedy killing.
Did you ever hear of a book called something like Leaves of Autumn? I can't remember the exact title. And I record all the names of all the books I read, and I can't find the book yet that I recorded all in, so I can't even go find it. But there's this incredibly persuasive argument about the connection between President Kennedy's assassination and events and involving Cuba and North Vietnam and Russia and Mexico. The never-ending conspiracy stories.
What's frightening about it is that after 30 years, we still haven't been able to get to the bottom. That's what's frightening about it. It's the not knowing. I don't think people would be terribly upset if they found out the CIA was behind it, or KGB or whatever. In fact, nobody knows, so everybody's distrusted. I think, so your husband was talking about the cynicism of our government. I think that's where it began.
I think certainly loss of innocence would often precede that, yeah.
Speaking of that, let me ask you a serious question. I want to focus on personal stuff, although there's one follow-up question from the other day I want to ask you about. In the green room here, a couple months after Ronald Reagan was shot, I spent the day at the White House, and we settled in the green room, and we did the interview with Mrs. Reagan. And I always, excuse my language, I always thought that she was a real tough bitch. I had the typical Democrat response to her, patrician, a little too grand, and very cold. But I had lunch with her, and we spent the day, and she's very giggly, and she loves gossip.
And I think I always liked her. I always thought she was sort of fragile and vulnerable and very appealing.
She was talking about, I asked her about near the end of the interview, about the assassination attempt. And she started talking about how much she loved Ronnie and how vulnerable he was. And she started crying. And I just put my arm, I didn't know what to do, I just put my arm around her and held her. And I said, "Do you want me to leave the room?" And she nodded. So I just went out for about 5 minutes so she could compose herself. And when I came back, she was sort of back in form. And I said to her, "When you look back on it," because she didn't want him to run for a second term, "was it worth it?" And she said no. When President Carter was running, I mean, I look at the Carter family. I was very much in love with Ruth, Jimmy's sister, which you probably may know. And that's the person she talked to before she died.
She was a terrific person.
And that one man's ambition, from my point of view, as someone who knew them all, destroyed that family. I look at Joe Kennedy and his ambition and the tragedy of his family. And then I think of you and your daughter. And I know it's too early to say, but do you ever have second thoughts in terms of what your family's going to have to pay? Because you're going to have to pay.
No, I don't. Because I think that for my husband, doing this obviously had a lot to do with ambition, but it also had more to do with what he believes about this country and what he thinks needs to be done. And that's who he is. It would be like saying to a great artist, "Don't paint," because people might not like what you paint, and then you'd be crushed. Or saying to any person who has a vision for his life in which the sum of the parts is nowhere near equal to the whole, because the whole is tied to something bigger than himself, that he should be afraid to do it or should back off from doing it. And maybe because I have for so many years shared his view about what was happening in the country and believed that both historically and generationally we had a responsibility that we weren't living up to. I think he is doing not only what he wants to do, but in many ways what many of us need him to do. So I don't have any second thoughts.
Well, I meant it on a more personal level, in the sense of, I thought I don't think the Carters would all, I think they would get a kind of shell shock when I got here, particularly the intrusiveness of the press and the intrusiveness on Amy's life and the pressure on them to put her to public school, which she hated and had no friends. And taking politicians and movie stars are very much alike, in my opinion. And I've known so many whose children went to rack and ruin because of the effect of public notoriety on their lives. Have you thought about how you're going to protect Chelsea from this kind of intrusive?
Well, we think about it all the time, and we're doing the best we can to limit it and to make decisions that we think are right for her, regardless of what anybody else thinks, because that's our first obligation as her parents. And we're blessed because we have a daughter who is sensible and has a strong character and who understands, as well as any child can, the kind of constraints that her father's position imposes on all of us. But we are just determined that we're going to give her every opportunity to be who she is. We are as oblivious as people can be in our position of public opinion and press opinion about how we live and who we are, because at the end of the day, what counts is what we feel about ourselves and each other, and we're just going to continue to emphasize that and do it in the best way we can. I'm sure there'll be consequences and costs to pay, but people who are never in public life have consequences and costs in their lives because of things that happen to them or decisions that they make or fail to make. So you just have to do the best you can with whatever challenges life sends your way. And I've believed that ever since I was a little girl. So this is not a new feeling for me. It is certainly in a wholly different and much larger context. But I've always believed, you play the hand you're dealt, and you play it as well as you can, and you take every precaution you possibly can to make sure that at the end of the day, you're glad that you lived that day and you think you did the best job you could.
There's a new book that I have with you about you. Yeah, which I read last week. And in it, there's a quote that you make on You had to make the decision, when you met Mr. Clinton, you had to mention, when you both finally decided to marry, about whether you would give up your life in the East and go back to Arkansas, where he very much wanted to be. And the quote is a kind of a paraphrase that you play the cards you give it. And reading about another place, reading about your mother and your father, I was wondering if you'd tell me a little bit about them. And I'm very interested in the evolution of your values. You come from a Republican, conservative, upper class area, and you gradually through the 60s, like I think the rest of us did, you moved far more and more left because of the social issues at the time. And very, very early on was your concern for children. Now, I would like to know where that comes from.
Well, I would characterize the way I was raised and the way I still am as being conservative in the true sense of that word, not in the kind of radical, ideological, destructive way that the term is now used. Because I was raised to be self-reliant and to be responsible, but to know that I was part of a larger community to which I also had responsibilities. And I'm really grateful that both of my parents, in different ways, gave me the support and the structure that I needed in order to develop a sense of personal self-worth and security, but also gave me a sense of reality about what the world was like. And part of what I've always believed, which goes back to both their teaching and also what I did through my church, is that because I was blessed enough to be healthy and have a strong, supportive family that loved me and gave me good values and discipline, I had an obligation to care for other people and to try to do something to help others as well. That it wasn't something that you did as an afterthought. It was how you lived. And, you know, my dear friend Marian Edelman, who signed your cover last week, has that wonderful phrase that, service is the rent we pay for living. I mean, I just believe that just as strongly as I can.
It's a very social gospel.
It is social gospel, which I believe in. I don't see how you can read the gospel and not believe that you have some ongoing responsibility of service. And so that was the way I was raised.
I want to ask you about your husband, if I may.
Mm-hmm.
He comes from, let me make a characterization.
Mm-hmm.
He comes from the second poor state. He comes from a family that in many ways was dysfunctional. His brother was in trouble. He comes from what, from my point of view, is a poor family in a rather deprived area of the country. And you come from an upper middle class family with a terrific school system, and the two you meet. Now, I read that the first thing you heard him say is we have the biggest watermelons, right?
Absolutely right.
And I think what intrigues a lot of people, certainly intrigues me, is what attracted you? I mean, was it the very otherness of the man?
Well, he's a very attractive man, Dotson.
Well, I knew that.
I mean, in those days, he was very attractive, and I knew nothing about him. And as I got to know him, I still didn't know very much about him. But what I learned quickly is that he was unlike anybody I'd ever met, and still is, because he combined an absolutely extraordinary mind with a heart. And it is just not usual to find people with both those great gifts that in such abundance he had. And we just started talking, we just never stopped, I guess is the best way to say it.
You're still talking.
We're still talking.
But a lot of marriages, it's the lack of certain qualities of someone that the other person has that attracts you. Someone is very organized, you're very disorganized. Someone is, some of the parts is, some of the whole is more than the parts. And that's what I meant, is what there was about him that, because he seems so absolutely other from your background that would attract you almost immediately and hold this thing going for 18 years.
Well, but here we were at Yale Law School, which is certainly one of the great goals of the meritocracy, right, if you're interested in the law. And so even though people came from very different backgrounds, they did have a lot in common. We had intellectual interest, ambition, at that time certainly concern about our country and the world. There was a lot that cut across all different kinds of family, class, ethnic, racial differences. And it was an exciting, wonderful time to be going to school. Because we all spent days upon end worrying and talking and carrying on about what was happening.
Exciting.
Oh, it was wonderful. And it also felt very real in a way that the last decade hadn't. I mean, I think we've been living in such a state of denial of our problems.
In the 50s, we were all asleep.
We were asleep. But in any event, he had a way of talking about problems even then, and a way of relating to people that cut through a lot of the abstraction that sometimes infected the rest of us. You know, we could talk about theories and we could talk about problems, but he could make them live for us, because it wasn't just his extraordinary storytelling skill, it was that he paid closer attention to what was going on in real people's lives. So he always brought that sense of reality to any discussion that we had. And he was also very concerned about people's personal well-being, even then. You know, so he'd be the first to ask, how somebody's ill parent was, or did they recover from that recent accident they had. He just always was attuned to what was going on in people's personal lives.
Was he fun?
Oh, enormous fun.
And
He's always fun.
And make you laugh.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we laugh a lot. We have an enormously good time laughing. But he was always fun. He's very serious, and he will, delve into difficult issues with great enthusiasm, but he also loves to have fun. And we used to go, some days we'd go to 4 movies in a row, because we were just incredible movie freaks. And there used to be, I don't know if there still is in New Haven, this little tiny theater, like this little, I think it was called the Lincoln Theater, which was hidden in a residential neighborhood. Like, it was in an old garage, as I recall. And I remember one day
you found it.
Other people found it, but we found it when there was this huge snowfall in New Haven. Everything stopped. You couldn't drive. And Bill decided, great fun to go to the movies. And since it was a kind of converted garage, as I remember, the person who ran the movie theater either lived in it or nearby. And it always was running, kind of old foreign films and all that. And so we called up, and he said, if you get here, I'll put the film on. And I mean, we must have walked through knee-deep snow for 2.5 hours to get to and just laughing. I mean, it was just so much fun. We just had a great time. And in amidst all the seriousness about the world and everything that wasn't going right.
Can I tell you a little anecdote and see if you haven't had that in your life? I was a great friend, as you know, I think, to Tennessee Williams. Mm-hmm. We were together off and on for 14 years. And when I first knew him, he was staying at the Plaza Hotel. And then we had lunch, and I ended up staying in his suite, which is very grand. And like the second week, we were going out to lunch. This is the second week I knew him. And and Tennessee was not easy. He was very bright, but he was very paranoid, and he was strange in many ways, and he was also a drug addict, so you had a lot on your plate. But he was going out to have lunch with his agent. His name was Audrey Wood, who he was about to fire. He loved to dress up, and he loved hats. In the summertime, he had his Panama hat on, and he had on this beige suit, and he was very careful about it. We get in there, and I look over, and his whole arm is bleeding.
Oh my gosh.
And I said, Tam, my God. And I took it back upstairs, and he took his shirt off, and I took a wet towel and I stanched the bleeding. What had happened is because of alcoholism, his capillaries would break. It's very common. And suddenly start to bleed. And he told baby it happens all the time. He said, it's the cost of living. Yeah, but it was at that moment when I was comforting him and trying to help him that realized I loved his person. In other words, the physical person itself, that animate being, forgetting all the other things that Tennessee Williams was, that person, his person was precious to me and was vulnerable and needed to be protected. And he drew protectiveness from people because you sensed his vulnerability. I was wondering if with your husband, if there's ever such a moment where you suddenly sense his vulnerability and his need for comfort, for protection.
Oh, I think that's true with any person you really love. I mean, I think that it's hard to get to the point of loving someone wholly until you have some sense of vulnerability and that it's mutual as well. It's not just a service you perform, but a connection on a deeper level in which you're willing to display that. And, you know, my husband has one of the most extraordinary strengths of character of anyone I have ever met or even read about. But he also has vulnerability. And that's part of what I think makes him such a great man, is that the reason he can look into the eyes of people and see their pain and really feel it and be committed to dealing with it if he can, is because he recognizes his own vulnerability. And, you know, I suppose everyone who's married to someone whom they love thinks that person is unique, but I'm here to tell you he is.
I was talking the other day with some friends of mine in L.A. about you and about the president. And by the way, I frankly I was absolutely astonished at how quickly the press turned. I mean, with the appointments thing and then the gate. I mean, I've never seen anything like it in my life. Did that take you by surprise?
No, I don't expect anything, and so I'm not disappointed.
You weren't surprised at how quickly it... We're talking about, but now this is public perception. I don't know if it's true. Public perception, it seems to be that the president is a garrulous, backslapping, warm, funny man who'd really rather be out, who likes getting around with a lot of people, telling stories and staying out late at night.
That is true, yes.
And the perception, I think, of you generally is that you're, and this is what we were talking about the other day, is what's the one thing we want to try to cut against, removed, that you're sort of intellectual machine, sort of have real feelings, and that you're sort of the Madame Lafarge. You have this overweening ambition, and then he sort of, you said, well, you know this. You sort of run the thing behind the scenes. Yeah, we were talking about this in L.A. I'd like you to comment on that, if you would, but and we were talking about the differences in your personality as perceived. And one of my friends, these are both screenwriters, said, well, she came from a very secure background. She had, I get from what I understand, a very loving mother, strong father. She had no real no financial insecurity. She was never in positions of being threatened by violence, being threatened with eviction, and the rest of it. And therefore, with the exception of her family was enough to anchor her. Whereas the president came from a family, I was going to speak to this point, comes from a family that was, to be nice about, dysfunctional. He had a lot of difficulty and pain, as I understand, growing up. Didn't have the best childhood in the world. And therefore, he was, in a very funny way, was on his own. And therefore, the regard of other people became terribly important in his own security. And it was necessary in terms of protecting himself, advancing himself, for other people to like him. And that his garrulousness and because he's immensely likable, comes from this, comes out of insecurity, out of a fear of waking up to, I'm talking about now, but waking up tomorrow morning and it'll all be taken away from him. And he needs his friends to protect him. Now, is that at all accurate in terms of personality description?
Oh,
is that too involved by hand?
Oh, I think that, you know, it's always interesting, but hardly ever explanatory to try to trace what makes somebody the way they are. My husband loves people. I mean, I can't.
it's clear.
I mean, I can't tell you what the motivation is or the reason behind all of that might be, because I only can surmise. But the net result is that he loves them. He loves being around them. He learns something from them. He likes to have a good time. He has the most extraordinary stamina of any human being that I've ever seen. And yet he also has his quiet moments and his moments of wanting to be alone and needing time to think and to collect himself. He's a complicated mixture of a lot of different needs and feelings, just like most of us
Excuse me,
are.
could you bring me a ginger ale? Yes, sir.
And so I'm sure his background influenced who he is, but I'm sure that there were other factors as well. I mean, where that old nature and nurture line gets drawn, I don't have any idea. But he was very well loved, and he was very supported. And I think that the fact that whatever difficulties he may have had growing up didn't break his spirit, didn't make him bitter, didn't drive him into self-destructive kinds of attitudes, either toward himself or toward other people, is a real tribute to how well loved he was. And, I think that it will be very difficult to come up with some easy psychic description of why my husband is the way he is, because he's a man of many parts with many strong feelings that are rooted in all different kinds of experiences.
Well, when I was forced to spend a couple evenings with him, I had an absolute ball.
Yeah,
because he's interesting because he has this enormous curiosity.
That's right.
He wants to know. He just picks your brain,
That's right.
and it's immensely flattering because.
But he's genuinely interested,
oh yeah, I know.
too. I mean, it is not some. I mean, and that's why all during the campaign, the worse that the press or the problems seemed to be, the more his friends rallied around him. And I think, again, one could look cynically at that and say, well, who are these people and what does all that mean? But he was sustained by his friends who knew him and knew the kind of person that he is, and who knew how genuine he was. And he is. He just, he cares about people. He thinks about their problems. He relates to them. And he is somebody who values whatever time he has with other people.
Now, can I ask you something it's indelicate, but I have to ask it.
I don't have to answer it.
You don't have to. You don't have to answer anything you don't want to answer.
Excuse me, sir. Buddy, can I have some hot tea with some milk? Thanks.
No, thank you. No, I just want some ginger ale because my throat is ticking. During the campaign, there was a lot of talk going around, a lot of gossip going around. And I think I told Lisa about the rumor the Republicans were spreading around about your husband's romantic life. And which I thought was, I told Lisa, all the presidential campaigns I've been in, that's about the worst I've heard. But I'm not interested in the truth or the falsity of anything. What I'm interested in is, particularly in New York, I thought it was heartbreaking. And I don't know how the hell you put up with the press attacks, the rumors, the constant.
Oh.
I mean, didn't you ever feel like saying, oh, hell, we're going home?
No, because why should I let other people who don't know anything about me or my life or my marriage make up whatever they wish to say for whatever purpose they are doing it and affect me? I mean, I just stress too much how important it is to have your own sense of self and who you are, and whether you're in public life or not. Because what happened on the public scale in terms of attacks or unfair and untrue stories is matched every day by gossip that eats people up in beauty salons or
workplaces or across backyard fences. And, you just can't live your life by what kind of mean motives other people might bring to trying to affect you. So it didn't really bother me or impact me in that regard at all.
You used to.
Unfortunately, it is never something you should accept because it's sad, but it goes way back in recorded history. It's nothing particularly new. It's just that we now have 24-hour global communication, so it's more pervasive. But people are always speculating about or trying to come up with their theories about people who are in the public life, and it's something that I guess goes with the territory. But I was watching my husband with the children's town meeting upstairs, and a young man from Chicago who had an obviously very difficult time, goes to a violence-ridden, gang-controlled school, asked what could be done to make his school safer. And my husband talked about the things he'd like to do with more police on the streets and better protection in the schools, including metal detectors and things like that, so kids could feel safe again. But I watched Bill, and he looked at that boy, and he said, but I want you to know that if you get your education, nobody can take that away from you. Anybody else take that away from you. And I think that's the way you have to feel about your life with whatever challenges are out there trying to trip you up or cause you pain or difficulty, whether it's a young man trying to get educated in a terrible school who's going to be taunted, as he said he was in this broadcast, because he was coming to visit the president, or whether it's some mean-spirited, person who wants to make up stories about somebody running for office. Years ago, my mother had me read a little article in Reader's Digest, which we faithfully read every month at our house, and I will never forget it, because it was a little article which posed this question: are you an actor or a reactor? And then it was, 2.5 pages of Reader's Digest wisdom about how you every day can determine how you feel. You cannot control what happens to you, but you can determine how you feel about what happens to you. And that there are two kinds of people. There are people who act in that way to try to do the best they can to deal with whatever life does to them. And then there are reactors who are constantly like, a ball in a pinball machine, just knocked around whichever way by whatever force is after them at the moment. And, I've thought about that for years, and I suppose it's something that has been in the back of my mind, not just when I was growing up, but, even during a political campaign. And, I said to my husband, are you an actor or a reactor?
What did he say?
He worked real hard about being an actor, and I thought he did an awful good job.
She said she read that in Parade?
Yeah. It might have been. That's right. It might have been. Actually, I confess, I used to read, Personality
On Parade?
on Parade, and remember that.
That is the single most, it's amazing, it's the single most widely read thing in the country. Let's talk about the First Ladyship for a little bit. Before we do that, what are the, when you look on your life, what are the people, women I'm speaking of now, in your formative years, who were influential in terms of role models, in terms of what you want? Because you grew up in a very, we both grew up at the same time, but you grew up in a very peculiar period when you went from a deeply benign kind of conservatism and conformity under Eisenhower, which I think was largely exterior, imposed from outside of the country because of communism, into probably the greatest rebellion, social rebellion the country's known since Civil War during the 60s. Very contradictory periods, very schizophrenic. And during that period, I remember people I admired. I admired David Dellinger, admired Camus, Sartre, and I admired Huey Newton because they were liberating, because they had ideas about participatory democracy and restructuring society and some of that were absolutely, it's like a window opened and all this fresh air came in. Who, in your formative years, when your political philosophy was forming and your social views, who were the influences on you?
Well, I don't know that I had any particular people when I focused interest. I remember, though, I was fascinated by Orwell because I was actually Aldous Huxley and Orwell fascinated me because both Brave New World and 1984 were just scary to me. I find it so amusing when people think that I'm in favor of big anything, because I'm not. I'm in favor of, as much decentralized local individual responsibility as we can figure out how to get in a complicated world like the one we're living in, because I just can't bear the idea of that kind of overwhelming control vested in anything, government or big business or big anything. And I was interested in women a lot, and there weren't very many role models or good biographies even in those days. But I remember being fascinated by Margaret Chase Smith because she was in the United States Senate, remember?
Yeah, sure.
And Golda Meir, who was beginning to, make a real mark, and I knew had been an American who immigrated to Israel. And then other women in history like Marie Curie. But what used to really be the highlight of my week was Life magazine. It was...
Here we go with another goddamn magazine.
Oh, I'm sorry, but it was always there on Friday. And I know you can't put this in because it's a competitor.
No, I can put it in.
But it was filled with these wonderful pictures. And if you go back and look at old Life magazines, it wasn't that they trumpeted women or anything, but they would. I remember they had one wonderful series on Margaret Burke White.
Oh, right.
I remember reading that in Life magazine, and because they were so big on pictures, they would, any woman who was a photojournalist or a foreign correspondent, which when I was in 8th grade is what I thought I wanted to be, would get some space in Life magazine because it was kind of sexy and unusual that you'd have a woman doing this, So I mean, without having, and I read, of course, I went through my period of reading, Ayn Rand.
We all went through
all of that, right? So, I read voraciously, and I read lots of things, but there wasn't any one person or particular movement that captured me so much as just the explosion of knowledge I was exposed to.
Speaking of women, she's this lady now. And I was told you don't like the term. Is that true?
I don't have an opinion about it. I don't know where that came from. I don't know.
Well, I read it, so.
Well, so it must be true.
Yeah.
You know what I'm doing? I'm going to compile.
We're in the process
I'm compiling my manufactured biography. I mean, actually, most of it's been benign, But if something gets printed, even if we say it's not true, once it's printed, other journalists say, well, it has to be true. So I'm a championship diver, and I'm on the Wellesley College Bowl Quiz Bowl team, and I'm first in my class at Yale Law School, and I don't like the term first lady, and you sit there and, oh, okay.
Where this stuff really gets bad is about years in the London tabloids, because they are so off. Because they don't know how Washington works, they don't know how the White House works, and they have a tendency to confuse monarchy with the White House. And some of the stuff they run about you is so funny because it is so completely...
It's so totally un-American. They don't get it.
It's totally completely off base. And they'll quote you. They'll make up a quote, and only they'll use a very British term, like they'll say, well, I told my husband not to invite those chaps here. I don't like the bloody White House. Yeah, I can get it for it. Yeah, absolutely.
The only one I saw was somebody, a friend of mine, still doesn't know how this happened. I mean, she ended up in one of the London tabloids with these, just what you're saying, sort of these long, very British quotes about me. And she was just like hysterical. She'd say, Hillary, have you ever heard me say something like this? I can't say that I have.
When I come across stuff that I think is funny,
Well, we're doing the bio though.
Oh, the unofficial bio? Oh, what a great idea.
We're going to do I don't know what to call it. There really needs to be a term of art for, kind of embroidered bio of some sort. See, I just got to worrying, though, that people were going to think that I've been saying these things. And I got into these arguments during the campaign where I'd be on a radio interview. This was my favorite. Okay. I was on a radio interview in New Haven, Connecticut, and the woman interviewing me said, well, you're coming back to Yale, where you spent several years earlier, and where we understand you were first in your law school class at Yale. And I said, no, I wasn't. Oh, but you were. I said, no, excuse me, I wasn't. Well, I'm sorry, I read it. I said, well, I know, but I lived it. I mean, I just kind of go, you know.
What kind of first lady do you want to be?
Oh, I just want to make my contribution to what my husband is trying to do, which is to undo the damage that's been done to this country over the past years and get it back on both a sounder social and cultural and financial footing so that it can be the country that we all thought we were going to grow up and inherit again. That's what I'm doing.
Of all the first ladies, which one do you? I mean, if you could be one of them, model yourself after one of them, or a combination.
You know, I didn't
what
know.
I'm trying to do is define you.
Yeah, I didn't know very much about a lot of them until this campaign started, and then because people were so fascinated by the whole idea of first ladies, I began to read about some of them, and they're a remarkable group of women. I mean, obviously the one whom I'm going to New York to honor tomorrow night, Eleanor Roosevelt, is maybe in a class all by herself in terms of the influence she had not only in this country but around the world, and the grace with which she dealt with controversy and took on issues that at the time were much more difficult. It has recently been part of our national scene. And one of my favorite stories about her is going to some meeting in a segregated community, and the meeting was in a church, and all the blacks were sitting on one side and all the whites were sitting on the other side. She went to sit with the black and was told she couldn't, it would be against the law. She said she intended to anyway, and they said, well, we're sorry, you can't do that, it's against the law. So she got a chair and sat in the middle of the aisle. And I mean, I just loved that spirit and her willingness to take on injustice and to stand up for people who otherwise wouldn't have a voice. But then I read, Abigail Adams' letters to her husband. And there was a woman who basically ran the entire family enterprise while her husband was off politicking and running for office, and who was not only skilled at what she was doing at home, but very aware of social conditions, particularly as they affected women. And then I think of Dolly Madison, who not only saved a lot of the treasures that we take for granted in this house, which I thought was an extraordinarily courageous thing to do. I mean, they're burning the White House, and she will not leave until she gets the Gilbert Stuart painting of Washington out and a lot of the other things that were saved. I don't know that there is any more single courageous act that's ever happened in terms of personal bravery in this house. But she also had a very strong interest in national affairs and was very insistent that women had a role to play. And you can go all down the line of history and see how women who've been in this position have tried to do what they thought was right at the time for their families and to support their husband and to help their country. And that's what I want to do.
The family doesn't have the right to impose itself between him and the nation's need. Even though Patrick was young, I thought, and millions of other Americans, that the nation at that time needed him. And that out of concern for his safety or concern for the fact Patrick was still in high school, they didn't have the right to selfishly impose their own fears on his decision, because that decision rested on national interest. Now, I was wondering, say you're confronted with the idea of a second term, would you make a decision based on the national interest, or would it be based on what the family was feeling? I know it's really premature, but I was just wondering.
I can't do that in a vacuum, Dotson. I just couldn't do that. I mean, I think at some points you have to put your family first. It doesn't matter what any other concerns are. And at other points, it may be imperative to put your country first or another kind of important enterprise. I don't think you can talk about that in a vacuum.
But do you have a sense of where the balance lies?
No, because I think it so much depends upon the context. I mean, I think that ultimately your most important obligation is to your family. And that's really where you start and finish in your life. But there are very important points in history when people have placed their religious beliefs or patriotic considerations ahead of what was in their family's immediate interest, believing that, whether it was accurate or not, believing truly that it was imperative to go forward to protect one's faith or to protect one's country. And I just think you have to look at that at the moment and try to make the very best decision you can, removing as best you can, ego and ambition and adulation and all of the false pulls of the moment, and instead to try to focus as best you can on what's eternal and what's lasting. And it would be a very difficult decision for me ever to put anything ahead of what I thought were in the best interests of my family. But I could see that in some circumstances that might be necessary. I mean, I think of Abraham Lincoln. How could we not be grateful for a man who put the interests of our country ahead of his family, particularly the very deep and terrible experiences that his wife went through with her family on the other side and with losing a child in the White House and the kinds of extraordinary suffering she went through. And yet we look at him as possibly our greatest president because he put everything subordinate to saving this country. If the decision were at that moment in history the same for my husband or for some other president, it would be very difficult to argue against doing whatever he could to save the country. But there are other situations that are not nearly so clear-cut. And sometimes people's egos get in the way of their common sense, and you have to always guard against that. And for some people, taking care of their families is a harder task than trying to take care of a country. So on every kind of decision that you're confronted with, you have to be as honest as you can about why you're really weighing the pros and cons the way you are, and whether you have any unrealized needs or desires or ambitions that might be clouding your judgment. And then you just make the best decision you can at the moment.
Would you want to give me a few minutes? If you could sit in the living room and talk to...
Well, I would start by...
If you want, I'll send you the transcription.
Yeah, I think I'll need to.
You can fix it up if you want.
I would start by telling any family I sat with that supporting and protecting and nurturing a family today seems to me to be harder than it was in an earlier time. The challenges are great and the dangers are so dramatic, but that there isn't any more important task to do than to focus our energies on giving our children the right combination of love and discipline and attention that children need to grow and develop to become whoever God meant them to be. And that for each of us as adults, that should be our primary responsibility, and that we have to be willing to maybe sacrifice in the short run in order for our children and therefore ourselves and our family to prosper. And it's the same as it is with our country. I think there's a very close parallel that used to be the conventional wisdom in this country, but which over the last several decades we have gotten away from and we're paying a terrible price for, both in terms of family breakdown and distressing problems with our children and with the kind of problems we see on a much larger scale in our country. And that it isn't ever easy to love someone over a long period of time. It isn't ever easy to give a child what that particular child might need to grow and develop, but that all of us have to try as hard as we can to fulfill that primary responsibility, and we have to help each other. No American family should feel, as so many do now, so isolated.
We need to rebuild some support in communities and through institutions like our churches and our schools and others, where parents can be supported in taking care of their children and being committed to their families, so that maybe we can look forward in the next few years to a less stressful time for families, for more opportunities for children to feel the kind of support they need, and for parents to feel some sense of satisfaction that they've done what they need to do in order to help their children. And that's what I would hope for my family as well as for every family.
Good. Can I just something today, because I went through the transcription, and I meant to ask you, it's just yes or no. In some cities now, like New York City, San Francisco, and other places, single people who live together and have established a family but are not married or are gay or whatever, as city employees, their codependents are being allowed to share in their insurance. Do you agree with that or disagree with that?
I think that has to be a local decision. I mean, I haven't given it a lot of thought personally, so I don't really have an opinion on it.
Okay.